welcome to Talk Truth. My name is Corey Huntsberger. I've got my father, Alan Huntsberger, in the studio. We're going to start off with our foundational verse. The earth and everything in it, the world and its inhabitants belong to the Lord, for he laid the foundation on the seas and established it on the rivers. Psalm 24, 1 and 2. That's why he's the owner of all things. Dad, your thoughts?
Yeah, he is the owner of all things. And that's amazing to me because, you know, the scripture says, let the earth rejoice, let the sea resound, let the fields exult, and the trees of the forest shout for joy. Now, why does creation sing? That's amazing. Because the Lord is king. Because he is coming to judge the earth. The world is not shaken by chaos. It is firmly established by his hand. The sea, the fields, the trees, all creation lifts its voice in worship. If creation cannot keep silent, how much more should we? The earth is the Lord's. Let us rejoice, for our King is coming.
If the trees get it, how come our politicians can't get it? That's what I'm saying. Like, dude, the trees, the trees understand this. The trees.
Do you know what my granddaughter said? She's going to university, and the university prof asked them to write an article in saying, what do you think the trees think? He actually asked them that question.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, what a great opportunity for you to open up the Word of God and say, well,
great opportunity.
Yeah, here's what the trees are doing. They're singing for joy.
We have to do this booklet, Living Truth. It's a devotional study on 1 Peter chapter 1 and 2. It's yours absolutely free. You can get it by going to our website, gotalktruth.com, click on resources. We'll send one to you in the mail. This program, we're going to get Michael Wagner back. We're talking about Leaving God Behind, his book. We're going to be doing chapters 4 and 5. And basically, they're all about the Christianity was the official religion of Ontario's public schools. Chapter 5, expelling Christianity from Ontario's public schools. Pretty fascinating stuff. A lot of history in there. He did a great job. Also, we're learning a lot of mistakes that our forefathers, kind of got themselves into, our ancestors, whatever you want to call them. But we're learning a lot. By the way, this is a discussion. No one has anything figured out. So this is going to be raw. You might agree with some things. You may disagree with some things, and some things may get you thinking, but that's what this whole program is all about. Michael Wagner, welcome back to the show.
Great. Thanks for having me back to discuss this book.
Yeah, Michael, we're going to start off with how we normally do. I'm going to go ahead and let you go into what, I'm going to give you the floor. Let's just get into this discussion, and Al and I will follow up with some questions. We'll probably go down some rabbit holes. This could be chaotic, but it's super fun, and we want people to learn that this is okay. Get some friends over, have some tea, grab some donuts, get a coffee, and just discuss. This is what we need to be talking about. And we agree to disagree, and we'll leave as friends. But go ahead, Michael. What happened in Ontario?
Well, basically in the chapters we're talking about is we're talking about Ontario's public school system. And like I mentioned in a previous program, how every political system is founded on a particular worldview. And the same is true with education. When you're teaching children, any kind of education program is based on a particular worldview or philosophy. So when Ontario's public school system was created, Ontario was a primarily Christian community. And so it's not a surprise that the public schools were heavily influenced by Christianity. And that's the way Ontario's public school system was, for its first several generations. Now, by the 1960s, this was becoming more controversial. And the issue of whether the system should have so much Christian influence, was a political issue. And it was interesting at that time in the early 1960s that Canada's most famous political philosopher, George Grant, wrote an article in favor of having Christianity still as the basis of public education in Ontario. But to make a long story short, in 1966, the Ontario government created a committee, the McKay Committee, to study Christian influence in Ontario's public education system and make recommendations. So 3 years later, in 1969, the McKay Committee released its report, which explains and details the significant Christian influence in Ontario's public school system, and it recommended that Christian content be removed. So that was 1969, and it was a recommendation, to the Ontario legislature for the politicians to remove the Christian content from the public school system, but they didn't. Things just continued on as before. But then, our Charter of Rights was adopted in 1982, and shortly thereafter, some parents launched a court case essentially to remove Bible reading and prayer from Ontario's public school system. So that ended up becoming the Zilberberg case, or the Zilberberg decision. So in 1988, the Ontario Court of Appeal ruled that Ontario's public schools could no longer have the Lord's Prayer and Bible reading in them, and they based that on the charter. The charters, it introduced a new constitutional foundation for Canada, and the idea of religious freedom in the charter was that we wouldn't have specifically Christian content in terms of the Lord's prayer and Bible reading in this context. So also besides that, though, there was still some Christian content in some areas of Ontario. Some of the districts still had Christian teachings in their public education system. And so there was a separate court case, which was known as the Elgin County court case, because it happened in Elgin County, Ontario, which where, again, the Ontario Court of Appeal ruled that there could no longer be specifically Christian content in Ontario's public schools. And of course, that decision was also based on the charter. So the point of this, in contrast to the McKay Committee, the McKay Committee was a recommendation for politicians to remove the Christian content, but they didn't want to for one reason or another. And so it ended up getting removed as a result of court decisions based on the Charter of Rights. So basically the argument is that it was the charter itself that led to Christian content being removed from Ontario's public schools, and also the Lord's Prayer and Bible reading.
When Christian content was established and was in the schools in Ontario, Toronto was known as Toronto the Good. That's what it was called. That's what it was nicknamed, Toronto the Good.
Yeah, Toronto had a very strong Protestant influence, like in its early years, and it was back in those days, long time ago, known as Toronto the Good because of the Christian influence in that city.
Right.
The idea, some people might argue that we shouldn't have, specifically Christian content and Lord's Prayer or Bible reading in public schools. But as I mentioned earlier, like every school system is based on a particular worldview. So if we didn't have that Christian basis, it would have been a non-Christian basis. And so, there are now, especially in Canada, different, groups with different beliefs and things. And so in our time, it makes sense to have educational choice so that Christians can be able to select private Christian schools like Alan had built in Calgary, and that other beliefs, other families with different beliefs could have their own schools as well. So we could have a more pluralistic system where people can have schools based on their particular religion or philosophy, and that way we would get out of the conflict of having one particular educational philosophy used for teaching all the children regardless of their family's beliefs.
Which is what the union wants to get rid of now in Alberta. Again, they want to get rid of all independent schools and Christian schools and everything else under the disguise of money. Even though Christian schools, if you look at the history of it in Alberta, have taken out less money per child to educate than the public school system. So, the union is, a big fight that's going on right now in Alberta to get rid of all independent schools.
What's interesting, you should mention that, because there's a petition happening right now where someone would like a referendum to vote against government funding for independent private schools in Alberta. And yet when we look at the history of that government funding for private schools in Alberta, it was actually Christians in the late 1960s who convinced the social credit government to provide some per pupil funding for the private schools. Like up until the late 1960s, the private schools received no funding in Alberta, but Christians organized and were able to convince Ernest Manning in his final years, his government, to provide a little bit of funding for private schools, like per pupil funding. And then after Peter Lougheed became premier, during the 1970s, Peter Lougheed's government increased that per pupil funding significantly, so that by around 1980, it was like 70%, similar to what it is today, that the private schools were receiving the per pupil funding of 70% that a public school student would get. But again, the purpose of doing this funding was to make it possible for families to be able to send their children to private schools that supported their family's worldview or religious perspective. So that kind of ties in with what I was mentioning. When we have the public funding for private schools that way, it enables more families to be able to choose the kind of education they want for their families. Because right now, when you have a public system, like I was talking about with Ontario, when you have a public system, it's based on one particular worldview. And today, it's not based on a Christian worldview anymore. It's based on a secular worldview. And yet many Christian parents want their children taught from a Christian perspective. And the only way they can do that is by sending them to a private Christian school or homeschooling them themselves. And so with the government funding to those private schools, it makes that possible for many families who wouldn't otherwise be able to do that. But it's a way of providing more choice for parents so that they can get the education for their children that they want and not have to just send their children to a particular public school system that has an opposing worldview basis for its curriculum and its teaching.
You call it government funding, but it's really not government funding. It's really taxpayer funding. And money comes from every taxpayer, including those Christian parents that want a Christian education. And so they pay taxes, plus they have to come up with extra money to take care of the cost of education system. So, whenever everybody says, well, public funding shouldn't go to a private school, hold the phone. There isn't such a thing as public funding. It's wrong wording. It's taxpayer funding and taxpayer dollars. So to me, education should have the voucher system where parents get the taxpayer funds that come out of our taxes for their child's education to make their own decision where they want their kids educated.
Well, that would certainly make it easier for many parents to choose, the alternatives that fit their families the best. Just the way the system works right now, it's easiest to send your child to a public school. And so most parents do send their children to public schools. It's the easiest thing to do. If they want to make a choice different from the public school, they have to make big sacrifices. Like as you mentioned, even with taxpayer funding for private education in Alberta, in many cases, parents still have to contribute more money beyond what the schools are getting from the government. So they have to make that sacrifice. And it's the same for home educating parents. They have to make a sacrifice in terms of, spending money on curriculum materials for their children and, not availing themselves of the various opportunities that are available in the public schools. So that parents who choose alternatives to the public system, they have to make sacrifices. So they're obviously making choices that are very important to them when they're willing to put time and money on the line in order to get a different kind of education for their children than what's available in the public schools.
So, Michael, let me ask you this. What did that look like when we talk about the religion inside the Ontario schools? Was that the Lord's Prayer? Was that reading scripture? Were kids allowed to opt out? What did that whole system look like?
Well, actually, that's a very important point, is that when it came to they had what was called, saying the Lord's Prayer and Bible reading are called religious exercises. They were usually at the very beginning of the day or the end of the day, and children were allowed to opt out. It was not compulsory. They were allowed to opt out, but the court ruled, though, that because it was so prevalent that there would be like peer pressure on the students not to opt out. And so from the court's perspective, it was too compulsory, but there was provisions, though, the children did not have to participate. It was just kind of a thing of peer pressure from the court's perspective. So, but when it came to Christian content too, though, I think some of the curricular influences were specifically Christian. But this is kind of unavoidable. Like with any education system, like I mentioned, the curriculum will reflect a particular worldview or philosophical perspective. So that's kind of inevitable in any educational system. So if it's not the Christian content, it's a non-Christian content. And so when you switch the public school education from Christian to non-Christian, like it might sound like, well, we're giving people freedom then, you're just switching to a different philosophical perspective that will be taught to every child. So that's why it's important to have educational choice so that children can attend schools to reflect their parents' perspective rather than just a monolithic government perspective, a secular perspective like we have right now in the public system.
Dad, what do you think? Do you think this is something that if there's an opportunity, would you push this again onto the public school system, or would you more fight for your tax dollars to follow you to be able to go into whatever school system you want to put your kids through? What do you think is the best route?
I think taxpayer dollars needs to follow the child. And then the parents are the ones that make the decision. And because then you have total freedom. If you're a Muslim family and you want your children to go to a Muslim school, you have that choice. If you're a Christian family and you want that, you have your choice. I think the system was wrong, where we all throw our money in the same pot, and now it's supposed to handle the diversity of us all, and it's not handling the diversity of us all. So that's where we get the conflict. Conflict is, no, our system is better. No, our system is better. And everybody's arguing and fighting, and we even have a strike that's based on the, oh, we don't want independent schools anymore. Well, wait a minute. You're not a parent that wants an independent school. An independent school means that we can, raise up our children the way we feel is right. And I think that's important. The problem that a lot of people have when we talk about the supremacy of God and the rule of law, they think that you're forcing them to believe God. It's like, no, you're not. You're developing a system that believes in freedom. You're developing a system that believes in choice. And that's what you need to have. And a society without God, that freedom is gone. That freedom is taken. So now they say, no, you will do what we think is best. While the World Economic Forum is best. Well, the WHO thinks is best. No. God put parents in charge of children. And it says, children, obey your parents. Parents are responsible for children. And that's where we need to keep that.
Yeah. Michael, what are your thoughts? Like, how do we go ahead?
Alan mentioned a very important word there, diversity. Like when I'm talking about the early history of the Ontario public school system, back in those days, there wasn't a lot of diversity. It was basically, Christians of various denominations. And so the public school system reflected the community of that time, which was a Christian community. And so that's why, the public schools would have that kind of Christian influence in them. But by the 1960s, we began to see a lot of changes, in Canada and the other Western countries, where secular philosophies were coming in very strong. And though this is where you begin to get the conflict, because the public schools began to push, a secular philosophy in their school systems, and yet there was a lot of Christians. And so you have conflict between, the secular perspective and the Christian perspective. And since then, other groups are now becoming bigger in Canada, and they want their own religious or their own educational systems as well. So diversity, we have this big diversity today, which justifies why we would need a lot more choice in education than what they would need 100 years ago when there wasn't so much diversity. Like if we don't have that diversity now, someone will be forced to be in an education system where their children are learning different from what they believe. Whereas 100 years ago, when there was a much more strong Christian consensus, they could agree on that kind of educational system, but times have changed, and there's a lot more diversity in our society now. And so that diversity in society should be reflected in parents having choices for education so that they can choose what's best for their family.
So, Michael, what do you think? I understand it. If I look at it, if I put the shoe on the other foot, I get it. Do I want my kid every morning, doing Muslim prayers, and then after school doing Muslim prayers and reading from the Quran? I understand how that could be offensive for people. And I agree with what you're saying. Canada looks a lot different now than it did back in those days. We didn't have all the different cultures, that we do now. What would your suggestion be on? Do you fall in line with what Alan's saying? Do we just let the public schools be public and they're in their woke progressivism, you know what I mean, worldview, philosophy, and good luck with that, and free up Christian families or other families, other faith, to be able to get their tax dollars coming back to them, that they can put it into the education that the children, that they want their children to have? What do you feel like the solution is? Because when you have Christian foundation, then that's what we're talking about. How do we build a Christian nation? With that foundation, but it's not necessarily the Christian influence where you're forcing other people to do certain things. What do you think the solution is if you got to start like a fresh map? Say Alberta separates. Hey, Michael, we want you to write the Constitution when it comes to education. How would you kind of sort that out, and what you think would be a good plan?
Well, I think the foundational principle of a good education system for an independent Alberta is recognizing the supremacy of parental rights in education and the supremacy of parental choice. Like, choice has to be at the center of an excellent public school system. People have to be able to choose what's best for their child, what fits in line with their family. And so Alberta right now offers more choice, I understand, than most of the provinces or perhaps any other province in Canada. And that's a good direction to continue to go in. We need to have more choices. Like, we have to have home education, private schools, charter schools. So the more diversity we have is the more opportunity there is for parents to choose what's best for their child. So that's kind of the direction that I think we should move in, as to create a better educational system. Right now, most people accept the public school system, like a smaller percentage now than, say, 2 generations ago, but we don't want to introduce a sudden major change that would upset people, like you mentioned. So I think just if we gradually move in the direction of more and more choice for more and more families, perhaps incorporating something like a voucher system along lines that Alan talked about, but just we have to make it possible for families to choose the kind of education that's best for their child, and that's the fundamental principle, and that would look different for different families, because some families, would choose homeschooling and some don't like the idea of homeschooling. Some would prefer private schools or whatever. So we have to give the maximum amount of opportunities and choices for families in the education of their children. And I think that's the kind of the basic principle we want to start with in our education system.
Good point. I agree. I think force feeding Christianity down people's throats does nothing. Even God doesn't do that to us. And he gives us freedom of choice. But I do see a difference. And what's attractive is when people do live their lives according to God's principles and values and his laws, you see the blessing of the Lord on their lives. I.e., last program that we had with you, Alan brought up Chick-fil-A. They close their doors on Sunday. Every Sunday they're closed. I've actually shown up on Chick-fil-A for a sandwich on a Sunday afternoon after church, and they're closed. And I was like, oh, I totally forget they closed. But they're number one. They're one of the number one fast food restaurants in the world, bringing in money because they honor the Lord's Day. But that's not force-fed on other, fast food restaurants or anything like that. They do them. It's almost like you need to do you. And the blessings of the Lord will fall on you, fall on your family, fall on your children. And that becomes attractive to the world, because as they're falling apart, as they're experiencing school shootings and yours isn't, you know what I mean? When they're experiencing all these horrible, horrific things happening and you're thriving, there is an attraction to that make people go, hey, what are you doing differently? It's working out so well. What do we need to do? And then you can lead people to well, we live by God's law. You know what I mean? We're Christian, kind of a thing. I don't feel force feeding Christianity down people's throats is a great way to go. A lot of people don't receive it.
No, and it's not even biblical.
Right. I'm just going to say, though, that the kind of free society you're talking about must be based upon a Christian worldview, because it's the Christian worldview that leads to the ideas of limited government and individual freedom. If we have a society based on secularism like we have now, we see that our society is turning away from freedoms and towards more government control. So we do have to have that Christian worldview foundation, even to enjoy the kinds of freedoms that you're talking about.
Yeah, agreed. Well, fascinating. All right, Michael, thank you so much for being on the show. I think next time we have you on, which is going to be next week, we're going to be talking about chapters 6 and 7. Fascinating information in there. People are following along. I hope they are. You guys are enjoying this conversation as well. We might even have to take this offline, Alan, and do a book club, you know, somewhere else where we can spend more time, because I know there's so much to talk about. We're not even doing it justice, but at least we're making people aware. And hopefully they're having conversations in their own communities. Appreciate you. Where can people get the book, Michael? Where should they go?
One of the best places is a website called merchantship.ca. That's Merchantship is a business based in Didsbury, a homeschooling business. There's also a place in Ontario called christianroots.org. You should be able to find my book there as well.
Interesting conversation. Christian worldview, Alan. That's different than forcing a nation a Christian like type activities, you know, and that's kind of what has happened. They forced Christian activities or Christian certain things instead of focusing on the worldview portion.
Right. You can't force Christian ideas in the same way that you can't force unchristian ideas. You have to let people make their own choices.
Yeah. But have the worldview of, you know, it's a Christian worldview.
Right.
That's the foundation where we're narrowing it down. I mean, we're figuring it out because it's like, you know, we got to get that balance. Because I think when someone's like, oh, we're a Christian nation, meaning you got to do this. Wait a minute. No, these people don't even subscribe to the Christianity, you know what I mean? Or to God. But
I understand. Yeah.
You can still have that foundation. Yeah. Anyway, fantastic conversation. Anyway, let's give away your booklet. It's called The Living Truth or Living in Truth. It's a devotional study on 1 Peter chapter 1 and 2. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. It's yours absolutely free. Go to our website, gotalktruth.com, click on resources, fill out the form. We'll send one to you in the mail right away. If you'd like to help support our mission, keep this conversation and truth on the air. It's fun discussion, and it's being broadcast across our nation, and God is moving for sure. And if you'd like to be a part of what's going on, you can support us by going to our website, gotalktruth.com, click on donate, many different ways to give digitally that way. If you'd like to do it through the mail, which many of you do, you can make your gift to Talk Truth and send it to 246 Stewart Green, Southwest, Suite 3260, Calgary, Alberta, T3H 3C8. And if you'd like prayer, we can cover you in prayer 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by calling our toll-free line, 1-800-915-0056. All right, Dad, we're out of time. We'll see you guys later.
Love you.